Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming. Or more importantly, thanks for all of you for remaining to listen to our presentation. For those who don't know me, I'm John Ross Reed. This is Simon Gash and this is Steve Pillar, and we're from Future Perfect Healthcare. Right, so I should have read the first slide, shouldn't I? So this presentation is not about applications. This is about our passion around vendor neutrality. We believe that's an important part of plank of our strategy. It's not our data. It's not even the organisation's data. It's the patient's data. And if we focus on that, then we can do great things, as you've already seen in the last couple of days. So this morning, what we're going to talk to you about is briefly a little bit about Future Perfect's mission and why we're passionate about that. What does that mean in reality? So Simon and Steve are going to talk to you about a particular use case where we've proved vendor neutrality, and then we're going to just take some questions. We've allowed a lot of time for questions and discussion because we thought would be some technical people here that want to do that. So let's see how that goes. Next one. So I'm not going to read all this out to you, but I've been working in healthcare IT for over 3 decades, mainly in and around the NHS, and for all that time, the biggest challenge has been wrangling healthcare data to make the right data available at the right time to make the right decisions. We've all seen and heard that mantra, and that's always been the challenge. In the 90s, it was about what we call interoperability and interfacing, and it was all about HL7 and messaging. Well, it didn't really work. All that did is create chaos. It created fragmented, incomplete records with substandard data, and it's really a minimal data model type approach. It was enough to get the job done, ordering a test, getting a result, admitting a patient and the like. What we really needed to do is get all the data in one place and use some open standards. So it got to the point in early 2020 where my business partner and I said, let's create a business to do this. We knew about the openEHR standard. I'd been working with it for at least 4 years at that point, no, 5 years in fact, thanks to people like David and David Ingram and Ian McNichol, and I'm sorry if I didn't mention you, and you've been part of my journey, but yeah, all very important, all very important in that. So it's getting the data right, but our passion is to be vendor neutral. So we'll work with anybody if they want to play in the open standards game. We can't do everything ourselves. We work with the very best partners that have a particular innovation they can bring to bear, and we can integrate it into our platform. So we're integrators primarily. So we have a platform that sits on top of openEHR. We work with providers of e-forms providers, CDS providers. We're working with AI providers. So that's how we see it working. What we're going to talk to you about today is a particular use case where we've proven that it's possible to, if you are going to work with open standards-based data, that you can do that in a vendor-neutral way, so you can move between vendors. This data's got to last the patient's lifetime, long past the life of any application, hopefully. And what are you going to do when your Epic contract runs out, for example? What are you going to do with that data? It's locked up in a proprietary format. We need to break that barrier down. So we need to prove that what they say about openEHR is right. It is a standard that if implemented, you can move between different vendors' repositories. So Simon's going to now take over and talk to you about our particular case study where we've had some interesting experiences doing just that.
Yeah, indeed, very, very interesting. Can I have a quick show of hands to see how many people have actually, so we're all talking about vendor neutral, you know what that's about. Quick show of hands to see who's actually changed repositories, who's actually just slid out one repository and stuck it in another one. I can see no hands here. Okay, so which repositories did you go from?
I mean, it maybe doesn't count the EHR based HIP CDR. I'm not sure that counts because they're close, but yeah.
Okay,
that's fine too, isn't it?
So I'm reading not many. Okay. So a quick introduction to the actual project that we were working on. So that's GenOceanic. So GenOceanic was set up as a way of using the 100k genomes data project that was set up by John. So it's a really good use case of if you've got a project, if you've got lots of clinical data and that project comes to an end, most NHS organisations will just bin it, okay? Because that's the end of that project, let's go up for the new fancy project. But instead of doing that, instead of doing all this, when you take an information system offline and then you just dump it because there's nowhere to store the data, you can actually bring all those things into an openEHR repository. And that's a kind of like technique that we used with the Gen Oceanic, where we actually brought in the 100k genomes project data into it. We could then take that data and then we could augment it, because as a integration style company, we take feeds from laboratory information management systems, we bring in data from Epic, we do all the kind of like stuff you can do with Cloverleaf, for example. We bring all that in to create an incredibly rich data set. Now that you've got that beautiful, wonderful, rich data set, you can layer applications on the top of that. So you can take clinical decision systems, and you can take AI applications, and you can build those on the top because you've got your rich data set. Having done all that, our customer, we were quite excited about this, and we thought this is quite fabulous. And the customer then turned around and said, how about you change vendors that are actually storing the database? Oh, sorry, the clinical data record. At that point, we all went a bit grey. It just reminded me of an anecdote that in my previous role with software development management, what we always did with these type of projects, we used underpants to consider how difficult it was, okay? So you look at a really tricky data one where you're taking patient data and you're thinking about the number of underpants you're going to have to put on there because this is a horrific project you're doing. So it was tough, but at the same time quite exciting because it gave us a real opportunity to actually test what everyone tells us, which is this is a vendor-neutral technology. So the actual requirement of the project was to migrate the patient health records from the Better CDR to Airbase. So how did we actually go about doing that? Well, the Better demographic server was being deprecated anyway, so we'd already started up a project where we're looking about how we could actually store the demographic data using FHIR. And we're a very open source, open standards type organisation, so Happy FHIR was a really good fit for us. So immediately we had somewhere to put our patient data. The next one we moved on to was Airbase itself. So Airbase itself, if you go to the website, you can see all the information you need to download the containers. So containerization for us is being a big, huge step in being able to implement software systems much quicker than we ever used to. So you could download Airbase, so we had the Airbase container up and running. And because we're a kind of like remote company, everything we do is in the cloud. So what we did was we run it all on Azure. So immediately we can spin up an Azure container instance, which has got Airbase running in it. Airbase uses Postgres as its relational data layer, which kind of like sits underneath it. So we had to set up an Azure Postgres service. But quite rapidly, we got the whole containerized environment set up. And I was particularly chuffed with that. The next thing you do is you need to move the data types, which is a lot easier than when you used to do it in the relational database. Because we would have to do all that scripting out, scripting back in, it's quite complex. With openEHR, you can just export your templates, dump them all out, and import them into the new repository. And almost instantly, you've got a huge, rich data set then of all your data typing shifted from one repository to the next. So once we got that set up, then we were ready to start developing our own toolkit of what we needed to do to actually move and migrate compositions. So needed to create compositions with existing composition ID. So we figured out quite quickly that what we needed to do is to make sure that when we've got a source and a destination, we've got a source composition with a UID and we've got a destination with a UID, so that we could just really quickly verify that we've got exactly the same on the source as we've got on the destination. And then we went through all the the interesting, let me put it that way, interesting way of figuring out, actually you've also got versions to these compositions. These all sit inside a version container. You've got to think about how you're going to bring those all into the new repository to make sure that you've got exactly the same version stack as you had in the previous repository. We managed to get our way through that, and then we just started looking at cohorts of patients. So we would just start very, very small, take a patient, start taking that compositions across, and then verifying the data on the destination to make it exactly the same as the source. And then we were ready to go, weren't we, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely.
All very exciting, and obviously lots of underpants on standby at this point. And off we went. We actually did the migration. I can't remember how long the migration actually took.
Well, I think that all in all, it took about 24 hours to migrate over. You know, as you can see, 8,000 patients, 300,000 compositions.
Yes. Did I hear a round of applause there? Yeah, so 8,000 patients, 302, or as I like to think of it, over 250,000 compositions were transferred over. We could verify it because we had all the IDs were the same, so we ran our verification to make sure that nothing happened. We didn't get any hiccups doing that. And then the really cool thing that we thought, or I thought, is that Panacea Healthcare Platform has got an existing clinical decision support.
So that's our product, Panacea, that sits on openEHR, if you didn't know.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that earlier. But
It's okay, you're in charge of products.
So the CDS sits on top of our Panacea platform, which I described right at the beginning. But the CDS uses CDS hooks, it uses standards in order to get the information out of the patient record. So even though we transferred complete vendors, the actual calls were exactly the same. So the CDS application worked exactly the same as it did on the source as it did in the destination. So it's kind of like, there's your proof of the pudding, really, in terms of, yeah, it is a vendor neutral. This does actually work. There were, I mean, I've obviously clearly made it sound like plain sailing, but there were a few gotchas in this, and there were bits which we found a little bit tricky. Luckily, we had people like Ian from Fresh Air on hand as well to help us out through some of the trickier bits. You need to be careful with the CDRX specific extensions you've got in your platform. So all platforms are going to start to give you goodies and extra things to make your life easier, to make the writing of the source code quicker, and it's all excitable stuff. And with software developers with a tremendous amount of pressure behind them to get results, you sometimes can take a trip to the dark side and not realise the consequences of some of those things that you've implemented. So that's one to keep up and keep thinking about. We had another one where the AQL querying composition versions didn't work, so that was a difference in that the way the AQL engine worked in terms of better than it did in Airbase. So it was quite nice and slick in Better, but it just didn't work, and we had to tweak around how that was actually done and use a slightly different API. So we've got things like format of namespace. Unfortunately, Berger's not here for me to point out some of these, but we did have a discussion with him last night about it. And you've got various issues there. So you've got external reference, date formatting. One point to note, that even though I am having a discussion about some of the tricky bits that we did in Airbase, it was Airbase 1 that we were using at the time. We're now shifting ourselves to Airbase 2, and Panacea, which is our big platform healthcare product that I keep talking about, it's now running against Airbase 2. So there's a whole set of new things to learn. But it is far more comprehensive than it was in Airbase 1. So some of the things that we already learnt have already moved on. So what was our conclusion from all this? Obviously, yes, it is vendor neutral. We've done it. We've taken data from the source to the destination, and it's exactly the same. Significantly reduces effort and data loss, but it's the no semantic changes required. I don't know if anybody here has done migrations before. So I've done migrations in finance, I've done them in content management. The finance one was always really scary. It's like triple underpants on that bad boy. And I've also done it in healthcare, and even in healthcare, it's quite tricky and quite difficult to do, and to be honest, quite scary.
Every integration usually involves some sort of data translation, and there's a risk of semantic variation.
Indeed.
This was always the problem in the 90s, that you might think it's the same data point, but it's not quite.
And that's kind of like so important. So if you take anything away from this presentation, apart from Panacea, which is our major product, it's the fact that there's no changes to that data. It means exactly the same as it did from the source. And that's just a huge, massive thing for us. And it is a huge, massive thing for me. And it was the first time I kind of like seen that, to be honest. We really need a compliance toolkit. So if there's anybody out there who understands compliance and how we can do this, pop along to Ian's discussion later on where they've got the solution to compliance. Because compliance is so important. I came from the Java world in J2EE where we used to use application servers. And that whole world revolved around the compliance, because without it, the gotcha list is just going to grow and grow and grow. And finally, migration is a complex process. You can always ask us. Brilliant. Okay, guys?
Any questions?
What's the name of your product?
What was it again, Simon?
It's called Panacea, healthcare platform for all your healthcare needs.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing your experience. I guess you are migrating the repository to a brand new repository. I guess it will be really hard if you migrate one repository to another repository which already have the functioning existing archetypes and templates. I would guess the archetype and templates, there will be some conflicts in versions. How do you do that? Or
So
what's your thought about it?
So you're talking about moving data from one repository to another repository
Which
that's already got
already
data in,
yes.
so consolidating repositories.
Yes, exactly.
Simon, I think this is...
I think it's overdoing it.
That is a huge issue, but it's almost like that's a governance issue. It comes into some of the work the EY guys are doing around federation, which is not exactly the same. They're not merging it physically, but they're merging it via queries. I don't think there's a technical solution to that. That's about people gradually starting to use the same templates and the same archetypes in a community.
You've also got to make sure that your templates are marching forward. You can't go backwards, because you'll be changing the timeline in terms of your archetypes and how you define them. If you go forwards, you should be okay. It's always like forwards compatibility is so much easier to do.
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about conformance, it's not just about conformance of, the openEHR APIs and the AQL and all of that you need to have two repositories talking to your application in the same way, but it's making sure you're using archetypes, particularly from the international CKM. They've been clinically validated. You're not just doing data modelling on the fly, otherwise there's no hope of bringing that data together with another organisation in the future if you're not using some of these certified archetypes, well, as much as possible. So that, I think that's going to be a big emergent thing in our discussions. How do we regulate that archetype space so we come up with a standard everyone can use? Because that's really the standard. I mean, everything else is a framework, but the standard is the data points, I believe.
And in the future templates, we're working up that value chain, or maybe it's working down, I'm not quite sure, but we have to get into how do we do allergies, how do we all do allergies, how do we all do labs.
I think IPS might help a bit, move us in that direction. Well, I'm hoping so anyway.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just from a specifications point of view, probably some of you are thinking, that's a really crude way of doing it, because I've helping these guys on this, but basically that's all done with the existing API, with one tiny little tweak.
Yeah, we did have to make one tiny tweak.
Which I think that's been added to the
No,
spec.
it was.
That's now in Airbase 2, that
They
change.
took my ideas, and moved them forward.
Yeah.
Which is,
I say that because Berger's not in the room.
Yeah, Berger's not here, is he?
And that's a really crude way of doing it, obviously, because it's inefficient. So I know there's certainly interest now in taking the learning there and saying, let's just package that behind if you like, almost an import-export call, a dump, and
Yeah,
that would allow people to make it much more performant, I suspect, and efficient. But it's also a great marketing tool.
Yeah,
You know, just to be able to say to customers.
It's important to
press that
it's
button.
important to note that when you look at this and this whole migration process, and that your very first instinct is to have a quick look on the openEHR sites, because it's bound to tell you how to do this, because the whole concept is built on this, and suddenly you realise there isn't any.
And I think the other thing is that last slide. If you think of the complexity of the openEHR spec, you know, if that had been run on Airbase 2, we're probably down to one problem there.
Yeah.
And not all of these are faults. Actually, one was a historical bug in the spec that had been carried through. But none of these were, and none of them are due to vendor lock-in. I mean, they're all, obviously, there are some CDR extensions which are inevitable, but the core actually works pretty well, 100%.
Exciting stuff.
Sorry.
Oh, 1 minute. We've got 1 minute.
So I was just going to ask about real time. So have you looked at, have you done a use case where you're replicated data, like in a sidecar kind of configuration from one CDR to the other? So, because right now your use case you talked about is kind of
Yeah, I don't think
Quite. We
No,
are
no,
looking at that though, aren't
you
we?
could really think about federation. If I've got multiple CDRs, I'll be thinking of federation. I wouldn't really be thinking of migration in terms of real time in that kind of way.
We might want to do that for performance reasons. We haven't had a use case for that at the moment. What we have tried with this migration though is not necessarily doing it all in one big bang. So we've migrated the historic data that takes 24 hours, and then we've just done a little top up for what's changed in the last 24 hours. So you can keep the users running and then just cut them over. So their downtime wasn't 24 hours. That was how long it took to migrate all the data. So it's not quite what you said, but it's sort of real-time synchronization.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
They're trying to check this.
No, and look, I mean, there's a lot here that people will want to continue to explore. So I'd really encourage you to get hold of the guys by the underpants and have a proper discussion with them over lunch. And yeah, I think they've also provided us with a panacea to our technical issues. So hopefully that will continue now as we move on to Sebastian. But let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.